Hey everyone, Dr. Lee Bryce here, and today we have a little bit of a weird day because classes at Sinclair were delayed by 2 hours, and so um, any class with 50 minutes or more left by 10 o'clock had to meet. Our class only had 45 minutes left, so we were canceled. But since this is our second to last class of the semester, I wanted to give students opportunity to have an optional Zoom day. Right now, there's no one in class on the Zoom, so if you hear any ding noises or anything like that, it's students coming onto the Zoom late. But it's not required. I'm not taking attendance. It's for your benefit only so that you can ask me questions about the midterm exam 4 study guide, logistics related to midterm exam 4, or anything else related to end of semester stuff. Just as a reminder, next class, week 16, will be our last class of the semester. It'll be our chance to wrap up anything. I will be up to date with grading on eLearn. As a matter of fact, I'm currently up to date with grading on eLearn. So you'll be also be able to ask me questions about grading one-on-one if that's something you want to do. Also, as a reminder, I have electronic office hours today, 2:30 to 4 p.m. So you're welcome to hop on that Zoom later this afternoon. And that link is available on the first page when you log into our eLearn page. In terms of your grade, it's always best to calculate everything by hand because sometimes eLearn and other learning management systems weight grades on accident. Like I didn't put that in, but occasionally that'll happen. So you want to add up all the points you've earned so far, divided by the amount of points possible so far in the semester. That calculation will get you your current end of semester grade. And then you can play around with how much our midterm exam 4 is worth to figure out how many points you need to get a particular grade at the end of the semester. Um, okay, I will go ahead and share my screen. And so this is what the PowerPoint for today's class will look like, week 15. We're talking about social change and collective behavior. And so housekeeping review, lecture, exit, pass, and reminder, sort of the drill for today. In terms of housekeeping, make sure you're emailing me ahead of time if you miss class for any reason. Communication is key. That's true on my end as well. So if you notice, I emailed the class at like 6:37 in the morning as soon as I found out about the official delay, giving you directions on what to do. And so hopefully that's being reciprocated and you're emailing me if you miss class. Don't forget my AI policy. Don't forget to follow all prompts and rubrics for discussion posts. You still have a couple more left before the end of semester. And then if you were paying attention to your email over our long holiday weekend, I did email everyone on Friday because the midterm exam 4 study guide went live on eLearn, and I also emailed it to you. So make sure you're preparing for that. That exam focuses on chapters 16, 19, 20, and 21. Although content from the textbook throughout the semester is fair game. And that's especially true for foundational theories like structural functionalism, conflict theory, and things that are foundational to the field of sociology. Just as a reminder, discussion 11 is due this Sunday at 11:59 p.m. So make sure you're getting that in following all prompts and rubrics, including the word count. And then I already went over logistics for week 16 next week, which is our last week of the semester. Just make sure you're in class to go over things like the post-test quiz, which is on eLearn and it is for points. You also will have the opportunity to do your end of semester course evaluation for our class and, of me and my teaching and all of that. That is official. It's through the university. And so it's a way for me to improve my class for future semesters. And then, of course, if you have anything you'd like to share with your classmates, come prepared to do so next week. All right, without further ado, let's jump into our review. So, we've been talking about health and sociology. In terms of the connection there, just as a reminder, there's an entire subfield of sociology called medical sociology, which is a systemic study of how humans manage issues of health and illness, disease and disorders, and healthcare for both the sick and healthy. Now, within that, there's sort of three major things folks tend to research in the field of medical sociology. Health disparities and outcomes based on structural inequities. So, what are the average life expectancies for different folks depending on their identity categories, things like gender, race, and class? The medicalization of folks from historically marginalized communities. So, how are we conceptualizing the term, sick and not sick and healthy? And what does that mean for structural inequities that already exist within our existing structures? And then the lack of representation in medical studies and diagnoses. So we've talked a little bit about this, especially in our unit on gender, but essentially because medical studies tend to focus on the experiences of boys and men, we know that girls and women are left out of medical studies, and that's true for physical health studies as well as mental health studies as well. All right, now in terms of our focus today on social movements in chapter 21, sorry, I'm also fighting a cold, if you can't tell. So, collective behavior is a non-institutionalized activity in which several people voluntarily engage. There are three main types of collective behavior: crowd, mass, and public. And those are essentially, they're pretty self-explanatory in terms of what they mean and the different types of collective behavior. From there, we have social movements, which is a purposeful, organized group hoping to work toward a common social goal. Social movements intersect with environmental changes, technological innovations, and other external factors to create social change. And then social change is the change in a society created through the social movements, as well as through external factors like environmental shifts or technological innovations. And there are sort of four common causes: technology, social institutions, population, and the environment. And so you can start to see how social movements and social change go hand in hand to create change in our society. Now, technology is sort of easy for us to think about. Like, if you think about something like social media, we know that a lot of social movements have used social media platforms and technology to share information and to get folks to show up at events related to their social movement. Social institutions also help to organize how we're able to sort of create these social movements. And oftentimes, social movements will focus on a specific social institution. For example, we've seen a lot of changes to the criminal justice system in the past few decades. And in response to those changes, we see social movements developing, trying to improve the conditions that exist in the current criminal justice system. Population also matters. When we see changes in population, so changes to where people live and how many people live in a particular area, that can lead to social changes and social disruption and things like that. And then the environment. Whether we're talking about, environmental change and social movements and organizing around environmental justice, or just, our environment, the world that we live in our everyday lived worlds, environment matters when it comes to social movements and social change. All right. And then from there, there's sort of three major theories when it comes to collective behavior: emergent norm perspective, which emphasizes the importance of social norms and crowd behavior; value added theory, which suggests that several preconditions must be in place for collective behavior to occur. This is rooted in functionalist perspective, so we can see how those foundational sociological theories continue to influence more contemporary theory and theory that is specific to a particular subtopic within sociology, like collective behavior and social movements. And then finally, we have assembling perspective, which focuses on collective action rather than collective behavior, addressing the processes associated with crowd behavior and the life cycle and various categories of gatherings. Now, as far as contemporary social movements and things like that, a really sort of prominent social movements person is Angela Davis. And she's been doing collective behavior and social movement work for decades on college campuses and within other social institutions as well. In her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, one of the things that she talks about is the role of technology. And if you think about the fact that she's been doing organizing, especially on college campuses, since 60s and 70s, well before the advent of social media and other technological advances, to see her writing on how that influences contemporary social movements is really cool. And so one of the things that she talks about in her book is the fact that folks who were organizing around Black Lives Matter, they were coming to her, they were asking her for assistance and help because of her um, long-standing career in the field. And she saw these young, inexperienced um, folks who were involved in these social movements, these organizers, struggling with things like police violence at protests. And so, for example, they were being tear gassed. And in real time on social media platforms like Facebook, folks from Palestine were actually tweeting to BLM protesters saying, oh, well, if that happens to you, you should use milk instead of water to clean out your eyes. And so they're giving each other advice on how to organize in real time in countries in completely different parts of the world. And so that's an example of how technology can sort of enhance and help collective behavior and social movements in real time in a way that simply didn't exist even, a few decades ago. All right. And then had wanted us to do a sort of discussion, possibly small group discussion about collective behavior and social movements. Obviously, we're not going to do that today. So I'll just go over some things to continue thinking about. So, social change often emerges when groups of people come together to challenge existing norms and respond to social problems. Collective behavior, whether in the form of social movements, protests, online communities, or everyday acts of resistance, can spark meaningful shifts in how societies function. With that in mind, I had wanted you all to talk about specific social problems and related social movements that have happened in the past few years. Now, one thing that I really like about this blurb is that we're talking about how um, there are sort of these meaningful shifts in our society. And the reason why I like that language is because it's not as though one social movement comes in and changes society all by themselves. There are several social movements having conversations with each other, and that's what leads to the most substantial change within a society is these shifts, these ongoing shifts. And so if we think about the example I gave of Black Lives Matters, well, oftentimes in our society, there's this misconception that it was the only social movement happening in the 21st century related to the experiences of people of color in the Black community and police violence. But in fact, especially on a small scale local level, there were other social movements and organizations that were advocating for similar issues. And so we sort of have this constellation of different organizations advocating for similar issues. Now, sometimes social movements that are sort of in conversation with each other, excuse me, sorry, I told you I don't feel well. Sometimes social movements, when they're in conversation with each other, they're not advocating for the same issues. They can be advocating for the opposite effect. And so, um, I think there is another misconception, at least in the United States, that social movements are always advocating for quote unquote progress, whatever that might mean to you. However, or reform of some sort. However, there are oftentimes responses, social movement responses to things like the civil rights movement or the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement. And so we see sort of quote unquote progress toward the civil rights movement and the experiences of people of color in the United States. But then we see a sort of backlash, conservative social movement responding to that. So, a good example that I can think of off the top of my head is we saw a lot of advancements for the LGBTQ plus community in the past 10, 20 years. Things like same-sex marriage becoming legal across the country. Even something maybe that's not as known would be like restrictions being lifted from gay men being able to donate blood and that stigma. All of that is sort of, quote unquote, progress being made toward the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement. But we also see a conservative social movement or backlash to that as well. So, for example, we have conservative nonprofits like Moms for Liberty banning books at public schools K through 12 across the country. Anything that may discuss LGBTQ plus topics, those books are often banned in public schools. And so we see that conservative organizing in response to or in conversation with the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement of the 70s and 80s. And so I encourage you to think about different social movements, especially more recent ones, and how they're in conversation with each other and how that leads to changes in our society. And so you can think about choosing a specific social problem related to some of these topics here. These are a lot of the popular ones that we hear a lot about in the news and things like that. So the criminal justice system, climate change, education, healthcare, housing, or there might even be another issue that you really care about related to social problems and social change. And then my goal was to have you research that problem, that social problem, and have in either small groups or as a class discuss different social movements related to that topic. So thinking about protests, campaigns, boycotts, excuse me, online activism, all these different approaches and strategies related to social movements and what that looks like, how it manifests in the 21st century as we think about contemporary social problems. And then the goal was to end by having you all sort of think about the strengths and weaknesses, analyzing using foundational theory and theory from this chapter. What are the weaknesses and limitations of the strategy employed by your social movement? And what were some of the things that they were able to successfully achieve? Sometimes success doesn't necessarily mean you've changed policy. For example, the women's rights movement of the 1970s. The big goal for them was to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. However, they were not successfully able to do that. However, in advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment all the way in DC, they gained other wins. So women were able to get credit cards in their own name without having their husband or their father on that credit card account. Women started going to college at higher rates, working in professional spaces at higher rates. We saw a lot of wins when it comes to the women's rights movement, even though their number one objective, or at least the number one objective for a lot of women who participated in that social movements, was to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, and that was not successful. So the way that we measure success when it comes to social movements can look different depending on the movement and the topic at hand. All right, I won't continue lecturing any further. Obviously, with no students on, class is going to end really early. So just make sure you take the exit pass once you've watched this video if you have time. Keep reading, study for midterm exam 4, complete discussion 11. Have a great week. Stay safe and dry out there. Don't drive on the roads if you don't have to. And I will see everyone next week, week 16, which is our last week. Have a great day, everyone. I'll see you soon.